Democracy in America?
Excerpts from Democracy in America. Kerighan will speak for about 15 minutes, and that will be followed by a 10-minute question and answer comment period from her panel, which consists of myself, Mr. Rogers, and Ms. White, and Mr. Fass here, just in case we need his help. So, anyway, without further ado, Kerighan Wheeler.
Ms. Wheeler, before you begin, I'll let you know when you're at 5 minutes left, and then I'll let you know when you have 1 minute left as well.
All right, thank you so much. Good afternoon. As you just heard, my name is Kerighan Wheeler, and the title of my thesis is The Problem of Equality, Tocqueville and the Dangers of Equality as a Threat to Liberty. I decided to write my thesis about the problem of equality that Tocqueville presents because I saw it as something particularly relevant to many events today, both social and political. Equality, a seemingly simple idea, has come to mean so many different things to different people, which is what I believe to be the source of several problems in our present age. In my paper, I use the examples of the American and French regimes during the 18th century as described by Alexis de Tocqueville to extrapolate some of these ideas surrounding equality that I believe to be relevant to our current social and political climate. Ultimately, I've concluded that the example of the French regime and revolution serves as a warning for us, showing our generation and future generations, firstly, that ideas matter, secondly, that equality must be practiced fully and not partially, and lastly, that expanding equality through government does not automatically solve society's problems. According to Tocqueville, the most basic and necessary step in understanding or analyzing a people lies in what he calls their mores. He defines these mores as, quote, habits of the heart, as well as, quote, the moral and intellectual state of a people. What this means for an honest study of the French regime is that we need to examine historical events and circumstances which first shaped the way these people thought, because these thoughts and habits serve to shape the next generation and how they thought and reacted to events. So it is clear that in order to study a people and their mores, one must understand the past events that shaped them, and the mores that shaped these events, and so on. In the case of the French in the 18th century, the mores that they possessed at that point in time could be tracked all the way back to the fall of Rome. The vast empire that had once brought order to almost all of Europe suddenly vanished in 476 AD, leaving peoples like the French isolated, disunited, and operating in political chaos. Soon, the feudal system, which so characterized the Middle Ages, was established in France and across Europe. As is the case with feudalism, most of the governing power was invested in local lords and officials, who managed and protected their lands and people. These people, in turn, would work with their local municipalities to feed and supply their community. The strict and obvious division of social classes would actually come to enrage the French in many years to come, but during its heyday, it was largely accepted. In fact, it was so efficient for those living at the time that the serfs were content with the fact that the aristocracy had many more privileges than they did. These privileges were seen, of course, by the lower classes as a just reward for the protection that the lords and their officials offered them for their work and services. Tocqueville argues that this sort of contract between two obviously different classes created a very strong bond between them, and despite some of the brutality that feudalism brought with it, they became united in purpose and ultimately relied on each other. So it is clear that equality in at least one form existed long before the infamous revolution ever sought for it. This shared interest gave the French what Tocqueville calls the equality of respect. This sort of contract meant that the lower classes in many cases were satisfied with inequality so long as they felt that it was justly served. But this lends itself to the question, what would happen if this balance were upset? History shows us that this balance was in fact upset by the rise of what Tocqueville calls the Ancien regime and the subsequent centralization of French power. As France came out of the Dark Ages, the weak central government began to assume much of the power which had been distributed among many lords across France. This centralization is best understood through examples such as the Royal Council. During this time, the Royal Council, which had been a formerly useless power, grew its reach until it had its hand in nearly every division of French government and society, including justice, administration, and legislation. As Tocqueville puts it, quote, it was everything at once. This same centralization was exemplified again by the office of a single man called the Controller General. During the process of centralization, this man was entrusted with almost all of the power of conducting internal affairs in France, thereby further removing the political role of the French lords and nobility, while still leaving the nobility with all of their money and social standing. most significant change brought about by this shift, and one of the greatest sparks of the revolution, was the extinction of equality and respect, which came about because of how hollow the aristocracy had become since the rise of the Ancien regime. As Tocqueville describes it, quote, "All those rights peculiar to the nobility found themselves in the same position. The political aspect had vanished. The monetary portion alone had remained and sometimes considerably increased." The centralization left the nobility with all the pomp and prestige that they had held previously, but none of the responsibility that should have accompanied it. And in the eyes of the peasant class, as the nobility cast off their responsibilities, they also forfeited their reason to exist as a whole. In this way, the equality of respect the French possessed vanished alongside the purpose of the nobility. This division and removal of equality helped to undermine the French's ability to practice any other form of equality. The resentment which built up because of this change festered into something far worse and came to affect more fundamental practices of equality as the revolution drew nearer. So we see that this resentment and hatred was built up between the classes, but in the end, this was not enough for the French to jump into action. It was the continued tyranny of the Ancien regime combined with the revolution in thought that would eventually force the French to fight. As the Ancien regime continued to grow in power and in abuse, the lower classes became rightly more discontent. Institutions such as the tie show how the treatment of the lower classes helped push them towards the revolution and towards the ideas of equality they would soon adopt. The tie, a tax from which the aristocracy was wholly exempt, placed the burden of an empty royal treasury on the poorest in France, who were the most unable to pay it. This tax, along with other institutions that only abused the lower classes, became the principal objects of the destruction that characterized the revolution. Moreover, the frustration caused by the products of centralization led the French to latch on to many of the ideas that are most attributed to them today. Because of the inherent inequality that the French had experienced for generations, when pushed to the breaking point, the lower classes began to seriously seek out ideas that would provide some solution to their unheard grievances. This search resulted in the attachment of 18th century philosophy to the spirit of the French Revolution. In a society where injustice and class discrimination reigned supreme, it seemed that a national shift towards the opposite ideal of equality provided the perfect solution. Enlightenment thinking espoused by authors such as John Locke and Thomas Hobbes provided a foundation in philosophy for the basic leanings towards equality and liberty that the French lower classes already had. Furthermore, since these ideas had already been tested across the Atlantic in America, their plan seemed much more likely to succeed. The hope that this created was more than enough to bring the people one step closer to revolution. However, their lofty ideals of equality and liberty were not, in most circumstances, what the actions of the French actually aimed at, despite their obvious desire for true equality. The French wanted to create a new regime based on Enlightenment ideas, but for this dream to come to pass, a new set of mores was necessary to support institutions for a free nation. In order to create these mores, they would have to change the way almost all of the French people thought and acted, as they all had grown up with the mores connected to a tyrannical power. But since the people who wanted this reform had themselves been shaped by French institutions and mores, it was almost impossible for the French to change in the way that they had wanted to. And so the French came to realize that effecting reform was much more difficult in practice than in theory. And as a result, they resolved to first dismantle the most oppressive institutions of the Ancien regime, rather than their mores. What the revolutionaries ultimately failed to realize is that by ignoring mores, they only cut the weed off at the ground, instead of pulling it up by the roots. Removing the institutions without removing the mores and habits that had created them allowed different versions of the same tyranny to grow out of the same mores. Because of their choice, their grievances were never actually removed by the violence of the revolution, and the chaos that followed left the door open for many more problems. The resulting violent and misguided search for equality eventually led to the loss of individual freedom in France. Without a sense of the dangers of the loss of basic rights, the people were seduced by the idea of equality and were only able to attain it through the pursuit of social equality and government intervention. For them, it became a promised land where the tie could not oppress the poorest of society, the aristocracy would not exceed exemptions merely on blood, and the reins of government would be placed directly in the hands of the people. However, their pursuit was not one founded in a love of true liberty, but in a rash desire for equality that manifested manifested itself in a purely social sense. These two separate ideas, hidden behind the same name of equality, led the people away from liberty and secured their fate under tyranny. In Tocqueville's words, quote, "They worshipped equality even if it meant servitude. Whatever impeded them in promoting their plans was fit only for abolition." Their desire for absolute equality came to outweigh their desire for freedom. In essence, they came to force state-controlled equality rather than fighting for liberty, which could have provided them with the real thing. Despite their understanding that nations were guided by mores, they chose to ignore their obligation to shift French mores, thereby eliminating the possibility of achieving the equality of conditions. By contrast, the American revolutionaries, who were motivated by the same Enlightenment thought and the same earnest desire for equality of conditions, had the mores necessary to create their regime based on equality, natural rights, and self-government. For generations before America was recognized as its own power, Americans were already self-governing according to the principles of equality, and therefore began with the mores which could support a free and self-governing nation. After the defeat of Great Britain, their only challenge was to create a new government which adhered to these principles. The French, on the other hand, were forced to tear down the old regime, root out the mores which had formed it, and build a new government based in an entirely new set of ideas. The French underestimated the importance of equality of respect and failed to recognize a more fundamental equality that existed in spite of class distinction. Tocqueville highlights this missing fundamental aspect by contrasting the French regime to that of the English. He explains that the English regime was different than any other European regime, not because of its legal or judicial system, but because the nobles and commoners were allowed to intermarry. In this way, the English recognized the most basic notion of equality in spite of class distinction and integrated it into their mores, which is clear from the habits and institutions that Tocqueville describes. The French, on the other hand, failed to implement this essential form of equality, which reveals that the revolution was rooted more in passion than in philosophy. Because of their misguided focus, the French failed in their revolutionary efforts. The consequences of their misconception were not just limited to the undermining of the revolution. The destruction caused by these choices caused the rise of a new tyrant and a new tyranny far worse than any they had experienced. Following the time-tested cycle of regimes, the chaos caused by the French Revolution and its lack of equality created the perfect conditions for a new power-hungry despot to rise from the rubble. This new tyranny, in the form of Napoleon Bonaparte, serves as a warning against misconceived ideas and choices and the effect they may have on a people for generations. In many ways, the ideas and practices upheld by the French and the Americans were what dictated the course of their histories and the outcome of their revolutions. Their mores were part of a long tradition which came to haunt the French and help the Americans in their pursuit of Enlightenment ideals. The contrast between these two regimes is a warning to present and future generations of the possible dangers of equality, showing that something seemingly as trivial as an incorrect understanding of equality or a misguided passion for it can have disastrous consequences for personal liberty. We see that the French were not only unable to transform their love for liberty and equality into a nation which supported and defended its ideals, but by demanding absolute equality, they also lost what little freedom they already had. Today, one might find 100 examples indicating that Americans live in a time as crucial to their future as the French did in the 18th century. But contrary to popular sentiment, expanding equality through government is not always the answer to problems in society. When it is sought earnestly, with careful thought and understanding, it can create the strongest foundations for a free and self-governing nation. When ardor for equality becomes undiscerning idolatry, freedom for all can quickly become freedom for none. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kerrigan. We're going to open it up to your panel now. So either Ms. White or Mr. Rogers, whoever would like to go, ask a question. All right. Seems to me there's an important implication that comes from your argument. You paint a picture of the French, in a sense, being trapped by their own mores and their own history.